Just coming back from a run, and I saw that I got question in, and I'm actually gonna try to answer these. It's three questions. I think I can answer them relatively coherently, quite quickly, maybe, or at least discuss them. So it's gonna kind of slide in ahead here of some other questions that I still have to do that might take a little bit more time. So the first one is if muscle oxygenation is related to supply and demand, do you see certain athletes on the NIRS device that can supply oxygen well but not utilize it effectively? And then if that's the case, what training methodology would you use to improve this? So this isn't necessarily an easy reply. One part is I think, yes, you can see supply and demand differences because that's what NIRS does. And I think you can differentiate athletes through something like a supply or a demand limitation, even though it's not maybe always as clear as we like. But I think it's quite clear that there's going to be limitations to something like VO2, something like performance, and that is not going to be the same for everyone. And there's different systems that will limitate different people. And I would say the general consensus is that in high performing athletes, there's going to be a limitation, kind of a central limitation, usually around something like cardiac output. There's some debate about that, but I think generally that's what people would agree on. So in terms of NIRS, that would look like a supply limitation. You can't supply enough oxygen. I would agree with this, that I see this with NIRS. The better the athletes, the lower they push muscle oxygenation values. So I definitely think that there's a there. Now, how do you train if that is your problem? How do you train that? Well, it's generally a question. How do you train oxygen supply? How do you train cardiac output? And maybe how do you train your respiratory system if that's a limiting factor? So that's not as easy. First of all, because differentiating these subcategories is a rather, I would say, at least to the extent that the way that I see it is rather a modern concept, because it goes beyond just what training zone are you in. It's really more a physiologically based question of like, how do you then stimulate which growth? And I actually don't think that's so straightforward. The answer is maybe harder than what people would think, but I would normally say, first of all, one thing you can do with this, there's numerous ways you can train your respiratory system apart from just doing your regular exercise. So if that's really where you think you're limited, I think that's something you can do. There's tools you can use for that. There's different breathing techniques. Just being consciously aware of your breathing. I think that can be very helpful. And then in terms of cardiac output improvement, generally said, it would be kind of the slow endurance is what's classically been used. And I think there's empirically for sure data there that supports that, especially that the better trained an athlete, often these endurance athletes, they have very high cardiac outputs. So there's got to be something there. There are some studies that show, for example, highest cardiac outputs taking place during something, at least I know of one, where it showed higher cardiac outputs during Wingates than during sustained steady state exercise. So just in raw number of cardiac outputs, there might be something there for certain types of interval training to be effective in promoting cardiac output development as well. That's question one. Question two, does increasing muscle oxygen supply allow an athlete to maintain power output for longer during lactic exercise? So 45-second max bike sprint. So I'm not going to call this lactic exercise, just high intensity exercise. And this, I would say, generally speaking, yes. So for example, the higher your ability to supply and use oxygen, so it's the combination for both, the higher your critical speed or critical power will be, for example. So there's definitely helpful, or if you do hyperoxia is a very potent performance enhancer. So being able to get more oxygen is going to be helpful. But for example, there are some interesting conflicts. For example, if you take EPO, so EPO, to improve performance, which helps you supply oxygen, not all untrained individuals respond in a very positive way, or doesn't have the same effect as you think would have. So there might be something that supplying more oxygen is most useful to people who need more oxygen. Whereas if that's not really a problem, so if you're rather untrained, you don't really have muscular capacity to use more oxygen, let's say, then maybe that's not the best. Maybe you need to improve local muscular oxygen capacities like mitochondrial density or something before trying to just shuttle more oxygen in. Let's put it that way. That makes sense. And then the last question is, if arteriovenous difference is the difference between oxygen saturation in arteries compared to the veins, then in what way does this help you understand how an athlete is using oxygen in the muscle? I'm not quite sure if I completely understand the question, but I'm going to say something about it. So AV difference is one part of one of the fixed equations, or it's cardiac output, the product of cardiac output and arteriovenous difference that gives you VO2. So how much oxygen you're consuming. And it's basically, I have oxygen coming in through the arteries, that's going to be 100%. Saturation should be around that, 95 to 100. And then I measure in the veins again and I have something lower than that. Okay, so, and the difference is, well, that must have been consumed somewhere in the muscles, so you take it as an oxygen consumption. Now, usually the venous side is a pooled measure of all the tissue, so but the most of that consumption is going to take place in the muscles because it's metabolically the most active. So it's going to tell you something about how much oxygen your muscles are able to extract, right? You're getting supplied a certain amount, which is going to be, is usually the cardiac output side talks about the supply, and the arteriovenous difference side would talk more about the use of oxygen in the muscles, which is actually kind of like what NIRS is doing. It's really giving you kind of this live measure of arteriovenous difference. And it depends on the NIRS device, how it works, but it's pretty close to something like arteriovenous difference that you're getting in live time. And now, this is kind of the same to the question before, which is more about how do you improve cardiac your supply. This question is, well, what adaptations take place to improve this? So the arteriovenous difference, that's more of a peripheral question. So I need to do something to increase the ability to use oxygen, extract oxygen in the muscles. And usually what's talked about then is something like mitochondrial density or function. So generating more mitochondria, like mitochondrial biogenesis. And there's different approaches to this too, and but it does seem to be at least growing literature that sprint interval, high intensity training is very effective, at least at PGC signaling. So getting more signaling to build mitochondria, and that it seems to do that better than like a bunch of these steady state. Now, I think that's probably true, especially in untrained, and it's true in short bouts or short sections of studies. If this is also true for pro athletes in long training regimes, I'm not quite sure, because again, empirically stated, classical endurance athletes do a lot of slow duration training, and they have pretty good mitochondrial density. So take it what you will. I think both is probably, but I do think there's a place there for sprint interval training or high intensity interval training to improve this peripheral oxygen extraction and utilization. I think that's probably pretty important. Now, other things are also, for example, glycogen depletion has a positive mitochondrial building signaling. So there might be a place something like trying to exercise glycogen depleted, but that also decreases performance. So there's going to be a trade-off there, but maybe from a purely signaling point of view to build more mitochondria, that might be an effective training path at certain times of the year. But you have to obviously be careful with that. If performance is the goal, that's not going to be optimal. But I think there's something there to be said as well. So I hope this helps a little bit, and or at least is interesting to talk about. Thank you for those questions. Bye.